On August 10th, 1862, on the outskirts of what was then Comanche era, near the Texas-Mexico border, a battle took place between Texans overlooking the Nueces River. This battle, far away from the front lines of the American Civil War, would go on to become one of the most controversial military engagements in the state's history. There, a group of Confederate troops alongside Texas state forces attacked a small group of German Texans making their way towards Mexico. The resulting carnage left a stain on the history of the Texas Hill Country and called into question what it meant to be Texan, and highlighted what it meant to have loyalty to one's country instead of one's state. The Texas of the Civil War was way different from the Texas of today. Colonization of the state had mostly focused on the eastern half, leaving the flat, open, and arid plains to the west sparsely populated, with the exception of the Comanche. Western Texas served as the last bastion of the Plains tribes in the south. The Texas Hill Country, a quasi-mountainous and hilly region, acted as a border between the Anglo-East Texas and the Comanche-controlled West Texas. In this borderland, settlers from what would eventually become Germany settled down. The Germans were refugees of sorts. Many of them were either the perpetrators of the 1848 revolutions in Central Europe, or were the descendants of them. Texas, and by extension the rest of the United States, served as a safe place for these families to move to, where their ideas about liberty and freedom were celebrated rather than oppressed, like what was going on in the aftermath of the failed revolutions in Europe. The Germans who moved to Texas, about 20,000 in total, founded these towns on the edge of the hill country. The isolated settlements provided a buffer between Anglo and Comanche territory. They also allowed for the flourishing of the German language, and most importantly, the preservation of political beliefs of the immigrants. When the referendum on secession happened in Texas, the German settlers voted overwhelmingly to stay part of the Union. They were morally against the institution of slavery, and wanted, above all else, to remain loyal to the Union, which they saw as preserving the rights that they had fled from Europe to gain. When the secession vote ended with Texas leaving the Union, the path was laid for trouble between the Confederate government and the German settlers. In 1862, the CSA passed the Confederate Conscription Act, requiring all men above the age of 16 to join the Confederate Army. The German Texans, being that they wanted no part in the war, began to resist efforts from the Texas government to make them join the army. The Germans had already created small militia groups. Their main job before the war was to defend the isolated settlements from the Comanche raids. Fearing that there could be an insurgency in the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the Texas wartime government authorized Captain James Duff to march northwest from San Antonio with a contingent of Confederate soldiers to force the German settlers to pledge their loyalty to the Confederacy. Duff's march north started out pretty rocky after he hung a group of Unionist Germans shortly after leaving San Antonio. Word of this spread like wildfire throughout the hill country and only made tensions in the region worse. Governor Lubbock then declared martial law over the region to quell the tension, but again, this only inflamed tensions. Having had enough, Fritz Tegener, a county treasurer from Comfort, Texas, gathered together a small group of about 60 men. Together, they would flee to Mexico and board a ship that would take them to the port of New Orleans, now occupied by the Union. There, they would enlist in the Union Army and fight against the Confederacy. Duff found out about this attempt and dispatched Colin McRae with about 100 soldiers to pursue the party. They caught up with them about 70 miles east of the Texas-Mexico border as they camped out near the Nueces River. McRae surrounded the men, and at 1 a.m. on August 10th, they ambushed the party. The key detail here is that under Confederate law, McRae had the authority to arrest the men, not to shoot them. McRae had already violated his orders. There was a short skirmish where 18 Texas Confederates were wounded and 19 German Texans were killed, and another 15 were wounded. While some of the German Texans managed to get away, either returning home or making it to Mexico, the rest were captured and executed. McRae then left the bodies there to rot and didn't bury them. It wasn't until after the war in 1866 that a group of Germans from Comfort arrived at the site of the massacre to gather the now desiccated bodies of those that were killed on that day. They brought the bodies back home and commissioned a monument to remember them. The monument, titled Treue der Union, German for loyalty to the Union, stands on a small road just off the main street in Comfort, Texas. It is made of 35,700 pounds of hill country limestone. The obelisk in the center stands 20 feet tall. Adjoining it stands a lone 36-star American flag, meant to symbolize the 36 states that were part of the Union when it was finished. The flag permanently flies at half-staff. The whole monument acts as a mass grave for those who died. The names are written in both English and German. The Treue der Union monument was one of the first Civil War monuments to be erected, and is the only one where an 1866 36-star flag flies permanently at half-staff. In his book, A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek, Civil War historian R.E. Kelman writes, "Out of a paroxysm of violence and bloodshed, the nation was reborn, a resurrection story that fits neatly within Christian narratives of catharsis through suffering. In this way, Americans remember the Civil War as a good war, transfiguring it into one of virtue and of tragedies into triumphs. Such is the power of memory, to smooth the past's rough edges." This line of thinking is great for reconciliation on a surface level, yet I would go further to say that remembering the rough edges is often more important. I think it matters how we wear away at the past's rough edges. I think it is important how we choose to smooth over an issue. By talking about past tragedies and attempting to reconcile and redefine narratives, it can then become possible to move towards true healing after an event. In the case of what happened at the Nueces River, it has become important to reclassify the event from a battle to what it truly was, a massacre. Today, the 40 men buried at the Treue der Union monument rest peacefully. The grounds are well kept, and Comfort, Texas is still a thriving small town. Their memory and what they stood for, though, is still contested. On the one hand, the story of these men was often vilified through the lens of the lost cause myth. For a long time after the war, the men who died on the Nueces were seen as traitors to their state, and oftentimes viewed as not truly Texan. But were they traitors? Let's reframe this a little bit. The story of these men, and the monument that they call their final resting place, today stands as a poignant reminder about what it truly means to serve and die for one's country. The men who were massacred that day on the Nueces were heroes who, in the face of an overwhelmingly hostile government who just declared war upon their former country, stood up for liberty, stayed loyal to their original country that they fell in love with, and most of all, they stood for the abolition of slavery. Their story cannot and should not be allowed to be forgotten. I would argue that these traits are what being Texan is truly about, and in this case, the men who are buried at the Treue der Union monument are the very best of Texas.